This video is going to cover the topic of adding integers and making an algorithm, part 2. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video, which should also be on your page, is what is the rule for adding integers when one number is positive and the other one is negative? So that's what makes this a little different from our previous video. One is positive and one is negative. Here's what we already know. If we are adding just two negatives, right, it's basically just adding the absolute values but keeping a negative value for your answer. For example, negative 18 plus negative 4, right? We would add 18 plus 4, which is 22, but we would keep our resulting sum negative, so it would be negative 22. That's what we already know. And here's what we need to figure out. If we want to add one negative to one positive, we have to figure out a pattern or a rule that we can use. So for example, and again, this is assuming we are not using our chips, if we had something like negative 562 plus a positive 73, how would we be able to find that sum? Right? It's a little trickier when one is positive and one is negative. But we're going to look at a few examples, and again, we're going to see if we can find a pattern that can help us. So we're going to look for some patterns, and we're going to start with a whole bunch of examples where I'm using chips just to demonstrate it, and there are going to be more positive chips than negative chips. And we're going to see if we can look for a pattern. So I've modeled 6 plus negative 4 with chips, and of course I'm using black for my positives and red for my negatives. And I'm going to see that I have some zero pairs, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 zero pairs that I could remove from my board, which leaves me at this point with these 2 black chips, which means my answer is 2 and it is positive. So just think about that for a moment, right? We had 6 plus negative 4 and it equaled 2. See if you can kind of think about any relationship between that set of numbers, and then we'll look at another one. So this time I have 5 plus a negative 1. I'm trying to look at the sum. This time I have 1 zero pair here that can be removed, which leaves me with these 4 black chips, which means my answer is 4. So again, think to yourself, is there any connection between 5, negative 1, and 4 that you can make that we can start to form as a pattern? And our last example we'll have is 4 plus negative 2. And again, I have my chips drawn out, and I can see that I have a zero pair here that cancels out, a zero pair here that leaves me with just 2. So again, looking to see if there's any patterns. On the side here, I'm going to write down what I've noticed. The first pattern I seem to notice is that I appear to be subtracting the two numbers, right? 6 minus 4 equals 2. 5 minus 1 equals 4, and 4 minus 2 equals 2, right? That seems to be the connection that I'm seeing. The second thing I'm noticing is that my answers seem to be positive. And it seems to be that the answer is positive because I had more positive chips than I had negative chips. And I think that because the positive number was larger, it seems to have kind of won out, and so my answer stays positive. I had more positive chips left over once I canceled out all of my zeros. So that's the pattern, or the patterns, I suppose, that I see when there are more positive chips than negatives. We're going to do the same thing now, but this time we'll have more negative chips than positive, and we'll see what patterns we see there. So this time our examples will have more negative chips than positives, and we'll see if we can look for a pattern or a rule that works for that as well. Our first one will be 3 plus a negative 7, and I'm going to get my chips ready. So to help me with this, I have my chips. I have 3 positive or black chips, and I have 7 negative or red chips. I see that I have some zero pairs, 1, 2, 3, that I can remove, which leaves me with an answer of 1, 2, 3, 4, but they are all negative. So negative 4 would be my answer. That looks a little like a 1. There we go, a 4. Now let's try 1 plus negative 4. With my 1 black chip and my 4 red chips, I can see I have 1 that's going to cancel out, And I have 3 chips left over, but they're red, so my answer is going to be a -3. Let's do one more. This time we have 5 plus -6, and again I have some 0 pairs I can take out, which leaves us with 1, and it's red, so it is a -1. So let's think about some patterns that we see. I'm going to write them to the side as I did on my previous slide. And my patterns are actually pretty similar. If I look at my numbers, right, I had a 3 and I had a 7, and my answer was a 4. So it looks like I'm subtracting 7 minus 3 is 4. 4 and 1, if I subtract those, I get my 3. And 6 and 5, if I subtract those, I get a 1. So it looks like, just like before, I'm subtracting my 2 numbers. But this time, my answer is a negative. Last time it was a positive, but this time it's negative. And I think that makes sense with my chips because since there were more red chips than black chips, once I took out all my 0 pairs, what was left over was just red, right? And so when I took away, when I took away what was in common from both of them, my value ended up being negative. And I'm not going to add any extra questions on this video for you to try on your own. We're going to try a whole bunch of these together in class. But I want to remind you that the essential question of this video was, what was the rule for adding integers when one number was negative and one number was positive? And it looked like, regardless of which number had more chips to begin with, we ended up subtracting the two numbers and then using the sign of the number that had more chips, right? The one that had essentially a larger absolute value, the one that had a larger number with its sign. And so we're going to practice that a bunch in class, but I just wanted to make sure we could look at some of those patterns and kind of prove to ourselves that there is a rule that we can use for this example. And so make sure you have your notes, make sure you have any questions you might have ready to discuss in class.